In 1969, Sharon Kinne escaped from a women's prison in Mexico where she was serving a 13-year sentence for murder. She had been convicted in 1964 for the shooting death of Francisco Guerrero, a man she had met in a bar and taken to a motel. Before that, in Missouri in 1960, she shot and killed her husband, James Kinne, in their home in Independence. She was convicted in 1962, but the conviction was overturned on appeal due to a jury issue. In 1962, she was also charged with the murder of Patricia Jones, her boyfriend's wife, in Kansas City. She was acquitted. After her escape from Mexico on December 7, 1969, Sharon Kinne vanished. She disappeared for 55 years. She became one of the longest outstanding felony and murder fugitives in U.S. history. Her warrant remained active in the Kansas City area. No trace of her surfaced in the United States. No trace surfaced in Mexico. Then, in January 2025, authorities confirmed she had died in 2022 in Taber, Alberta, Canada. She had lived there under the alias Diedra Glabus, sometimes spelled Diedra L, and was known locally as D. She had married James Glabus in Los Angeles in 1970. They moved to Canada around 1973 or 1979. She ran a local motel in Taber at first. Later, she operated a Century 21 real estate agency. She lived quietly in a small town of about 8,000 people. She blended in. She built a life. She was never detected. An anonymous tip arrived in December 2023. It went to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and the Kansas City Police Department. The tip said Sharon Kinne had been living in southern Alberta and had died there under the name Diedra Glabus. A cross-border investigation began with Canadian authorities. Fingerprint comparison from funeral home records confirmed her identity on May 31, 2024, 64 years after her initial arrest in Missouri. The public announcement came between January 17th and 30th, 2025. Jackson County Sheriff and Kansas City Police held a news conference. They stated the case was officially closed. The fugitive had been located. She was deceased. No new charges could be filed. The warrant was resolved. This is the story of Sharon Kinne, a suspected serial killer who disappeared across borders and lived quietly in plain sight for over half a century. But first, who was Sharon Kinne, and what crimes led her to flee to Mexico?
Before we continue with this chilling story, we would like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like resolved cold cases like this one. Sharon Kinne was born Sharon Novak. She married James Kinne and settled in Independence, Missouri, near Kansas City. In the early 1960s, she lived an ordinary suburban life on the surface. Household routines, social connections, the daily patterns of a young married woman in the American Midwest. Beneath that surface, she became the subject of multiple murder investigations. She was suspected in the deaths of at least 3 people between 1960 and 1964. Reports from that era and later court records describe her as intelligent. She was manipulative in her interactions. She was charming in a way that disarmed those around her. These traits, intelligence, manipulation, charm, were noted by investigators, prosecutors, and journalists who covered her cases. They were the lens through which her actions were viewed. They were the explanation offered for how she navigated suspicion, trials, and eventual escape. In 1960, she shot and killed her husband, James Kinne, in their home in Independence. She was tried in 1962. She was convicted. The conviction was overturned on appeal because of issues with the jury. She faced a second trial. Before it concluded, she was charged in 1962 with the murder of Patricia Jones, the wife of her boyfriend, in Kansas City, Missouri. She was acquitted in that case. The James Kinne case remained unsolved after the overturned conviction. In 1964, she traveled to Mexico. She met Francisco Guerrero in a bar. She took him to a motel. She shot him. She was arrested, tried, and convicted in Mexico for his murder. She sentenced 13 years in a women's prison. She served part of that sentence. On December 7, 1969, she escaped. She fled the prison. She crossed borders. She disappeared. Her escape was clean. No immediate trace was found. She had planned it carefully. She had the resources and the cunning to vanish completely. She left behind an outstanding warrant in the United States for the murder of James Kinne. That warrant remained active in the Kansas City area. It became one of the longest-running felony and murder warrants in U.S. history. For 55 years, no credible sighting was confirmed. No arrest was made. No new evidence surfaced. She had effectively erased her presence from the systems that sought her.
She resurfaced only after her death. She had lived under the alias Diedra Glabus, sometimes spelled Diedra L, and was known locally as D. She married James Glabus in Los Angeles in 1970. They moved to Canada around 1973 or 1979. She settled in Taber, Alberta, a small prairie town of about 8,000 people. She ran a local motel when she first arrived. Later, she operated a Century 21 real estate agency. She conducted property showings. She handled sales. She became part of the community. She lived quietly. She blended in. She was never recognized. An anonymous tip arrived in December 2023. It went to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and the Kansas City Police Department. The tip said Sharon Kinne had lived in southern Alberta and had died there under the name Diedra Glabus. A cross-border investigation began with Canadian authorities. Fingerprint comparison from funeral home records confirmed her identity on May 31, 2024, 64 years after her initial arrest in Missouri. The public announcement came between January 17th and 30th, 2025. Jackson County Sheriff and Kansas City Police held a news conference. They stated the case was officially closed. The fugitive had been located. She was deceased. No new charges could be filed. The warrant was resolved. Respectful 1960s-era archival photos appear on screen, if public images exist, showing Kansas City streets, Independence homes, the ordinary American Midwest backdrop of her early life. Stock imagery of a Mexican prison fades in, general views of facility gates, no specific inmates. The transition is gentle to modern Canadian prairie, wide fields, small-town Taber streets, a Century 21 sign in soft focus. These visuals are restrained. They are not dramatic. They show the journey from Missouri to Mexico to Canada. They show the places where she lived openly under another name. They show the contrast between the suspicion she left behind and the ordinary life she built. Her crimes began in 1960 in Missouri. In 1960, Sharon Kinne shot and killed James Kinne in their bedroom in Independence, Missouri. The incident occurred in their home. She was arrested. She was tried in 1962. A jury found her guilty. She was convicted. The conviction was overturned on appeal. The reason was an issue with the jury. The case was remanded for retrial. Before that retrial could conclude, new charges arose. In 1962, Sharon Kinne was charged with the murder of Patricia Jones in Kansas City, Missouri. Patricia Jones was the wife of Sharon's boyfriend at the time. The case went to trial. Sharon was acquitted. The jury found her not guilty. She was released from custody on that charge. The James Kinne case remained unresolved. The overturned conviction meant no final judgment. No sentence stood. She was free pending retrial. In 1964, Sharon Kinne traveled to Mexico. She met Francisco Guerrero in a bar. She took him to a motel. She shot him. Mexican authorities arrested her. She was tried in Mexico. She was convicted of his murder. She was sentenced to 13 years in a women's prison. She began serving that sentence. The three incidents, 1960 in Independence, 1962 in Kansas City, 1964 in Mexico, were investigated separately at the time. The Missouri cases were handled by local and state authorities. The Mexican case was handled entirely under Mexican jurisdiction. No formal international linkage was made in the 1960s. No cross-border coordination occurred. The crimes were treated as distinct events. They were prosecuted in their respective jurisdictions. The outcomes were separate. One conviction overturned, one acquittal, one foreign sentence. Respectful, non-graphic timeline graphics appear on screen. 1960 marked with the shooting of James Kinne in Independence, 1962 marked with the charge and acquittal in the Patricia Jones case in Kansas City, 1964 marked with the conviction for Francisco Guerrero's murder in Mexico. Aerial maps show the locations, Independence and Kansas City in Missouri, then the shift south to Mexico. Blurred stock images of 1960s urban scenes fade in. Midwest American streets, Kansas City buildings, Mexican motel exteriors, ordinary places that became extraordinary in tragedy. These visuals are restrained. They are not dramatic. They show the geographical progression. They show the separate chapters of her legal history. They show the absence of any visible connection at the time. She escaped a Mexican prison in 1969 and disappeared for 55 years. After her escape, Sharon Kinne vanished across borders.
Sharon Kinne escaped from a women's prison in Mexico on December 7, 1969. She had been serving a 13-year sentence for the murder of Francisco Guerrero. The escape was clean. No immediate trace was found. She crossed borders. She disappeared completely. Her outstanding warrant in the United States for the murder of James Kinne remained active in the Kansas City area. It became one of the longest-running felony and murder warrants in U.S. history. For 55 years, no credible sighting was confirmed. No arrest was made. No new evidence surfaced. She had vanished. The challenges of pursuing a fugitive across borders in that era were immense. This was the pre-digital age. There was no widespread digital tracking. No cell phones left location data. No international databases shared information in real time. No DNA databases existed to compare samples across countries. Jurisdiction issues complicated every step. The United States could not easily extradite from Mexico or Canada without cooperation. International agreements were limited. Paper records moved slowly. Tips had to be followed manually. Leads had to be verified through letters, phone calls, and in-person interviews. Sharon Kinne had fled to Mexico first. She escaped from there. She crossed into the United States again, or perhaps directly into Canada. The trail went cold. She lived under the alias Diedra Glabus, sometimes spelled Diedra L, and was known locally as D. She married James Glabus in Los Angeles in 1970. They moved to Canada around 1973 or 1979. They settled in Tabor, Alberta, a small prairie town with a population of about 8,000. She ran a local motel when she first arrived. She managed daily operations. She greeted guests. She handled bookings. Later, she operated a Century 21 real estate agency. She showed properties. She closed sales. She became part of the community. She blended in. She lived openly. She was never recognized. Non-graphic timelines appear on screen, from December 7, 1969, marked with her escape from the Mexican prison, through the long years of silence, to her death in 2022 and the confirmation in 2025. A map traces the journey: Missouri to Mexico, then north to Los Angeles, then across the border to Tabor, Alberta. Respectful imagery of Tabor fades in. Wide prairie skies, small town streets, the quiet beauty of a community where people know one another. These visuals are gentle. They are not dramatic. They show the places she moved through. They show the life she built under a new name. They show the contrast between the warrant in Kansas City and the ordinary days in Alberta. How does a fugitive wanted for murder live openly in a small Canadian town for over 50 years? That question has lingered since the escape in 1969. The answer came from an anonymous tip in December 2023.
After escaping from the women's prison in Mexico on December 7, 1969, Sharon Kinne disappeared completely from the reach of law enforcement. The escape was executed with precision. She left no immediate trail. She crossed international borders without detection. She became one of the longest outstanding felony and murder fugitives in United States history. Her warrant, originating in the Kansas City area, remained active for more than 55 years. No credible sighting was confirmed in the United States. No credible sighting was confirmed in Mexico. The warrant stayed open. It was reviewed. It was updated. It was never closed. The challenges of locating her were immense and rooted in the era of her escape. There was no digital tracking in 1969. There were no cell phones to monitor. There was no widespread database of aliases or movements. International jurisdiction issues made pursuit difficult. Mexico and the United States had limited real-time cooperation on fugitive cases at that time. Once she crossed the border, she entered a new legal reality. Once she crossed another border into Canada, she entered another. She existed in the gaps between systems. She existed in the absence of technology that could have followed her. She existed in the silence of a name no one was looking for. She lived under the alias Diedra Glabus, sometimes spelled Diedra L, and was known locally as D. She married James Glabus in Los Angeles in 1970. They moved to Canada around 1973 or 1979. They settled in Tabor, Alberta, a small prairie town of about 8,000 people. She ran a local motel when she first arrived. She managed the property. She greeted guests. She handled reservations. Later, she operated a Century 21 real estate agency. She conducted property showings. She handled sales transactions. She became part of the community fabric. She was known as a businesswoman. She was known as a neighbor. She was never recognized as the fugitive from Missouri. Tabor is a quiet place. It is a place of wide fields and long winters. It is a place where people know one another by name. It is a place where newcomers are welcomed but rarely scrutinized. Sharon Kinne, now Diedra Glabus, fit in. She built relationships. She conducted business. She lived openly. She lived without fear of recognition. She lived without the shadow of her past catching up. She lived for more than 40 years in plain sight. She lived under a name that carried no criminal record. She lived in a country that had no warrant for her arrest. The question lingers:
How does a fugitive wanted for murder live openly in a small Canadian town for over 50 years? She changed her name. She changed her country. She changed her profession. She changed her daily life. She changed everything that could connect her to the woman who escaped a Mexican prison in 1969. She did not hide in shadows. She did not live in isolation. She lived in the open. She lived among people who had no reason to suspect her. She lived among people who knew her only as Dee. She lived among people who trusted her with their real estate needs. She lived among people who saw her as a business owner. She lived among people who never asked about her past. The manhunt was long. It was quiet. It was sustained by the warrant that never expired. It was sustained by the memory that never faded in the Kansas City area. It was sustained by the possibility that one day she might surface. It was sustained by the hope that one day she might be found. It was sustained by the belief that justice does not have an expiration date. It was sustained by the simple fact that a warrant remains active until it is resolved. The answer came from an anonymous tip in December 2023.
In December 2023, an anonymous tip arrived at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and the Kansas City Police Department. The tip stated that Sharon Kinne had been living in southern Alberta, Canada, and had died there under the name Diedra Glabus. It was not a vague rumor. It was specific. It named the alias. It named the location. It named the outcome. Investigators did not dismiss it. They treated it seriously. They began a cross-border investigation with Canadian authorities. They requested records. They coordinated with law enforcement in Alberta. They moved carefully. They knew the case had been cold for more than 50 years. They knew every detail had to be verified. They obtained funeral home records from Tabor. They retrieved fingerprints taken at the time of death. They compared those fingerprints to the known prints from Sharon Kinne's original arrest in Missouri in 1960. The comparison was conclusive. On May 31, 2024, 64 years after that first arrest, the identity was confirmed. The woman known in Tabor as Diedra Glabus, nicknamed Dee, was Sharon Kinne. She had died of natural causes on January 21, 2022, at the age of 82. She had lived in Tabor since around 1973 or 1979. She had married James Glabus in Los Angeles in 1970. She had run a local motel when she first arrived. She had later operated a Century 21 real estate agency. She had conducted property showings. She had handled sales. She had become part of the small community of about 8,000 people. She had blended in completely. The public announcement came between January 17th and 30th, 2025. The Jackson County Sheriff and Kansas City Police held a news conference. They stated that the case was officially closed. The fugitive had been located. She was deceased. No new charges could be filed. The warrant was resolved. The longest outstanding felony and murder warrant in U.S. history, one that had remained active in the Kansas City area since the late 1960s, was brought to an end. Non-graphic fingerprint comparison stock imagery appears on screen. General views of forensic matching processes, side-by-side prints under magnification, the quiet certainty of science confirming identity. A timeline stretches from 1969, marked with her escape from the Mexican prison, through the long decades of silence, to her death in 2022 and the confirmation in 2024 and announcement in 2025. Excerpts from the January 2025 press conference fade in, officials speaking with calm authority, stating the anonymous tip, the cross-border work, the fingerprint match, the closure of the case. These visuals are restrained. They are not dramatic. They show the process that ended a 55-year manhunt. They show the quiet power of an anonymous tip. They show the meticulous coordination between U.S. and Canadian authorities. They show the finality of confirmation after 64 years from her initial arrest. The breakthrough was the result of deliberate choices. The tipster chose to come forward in December 2023. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office and Kansas City Police chose to act on it. Canadian authorities chose to cooperate fully. Investigators chose to pursue fingerprint records from funeral homes. Forensic technicians chose to perform the comparison. Every step was careful. Every step was documented. Every step honored the warrant that had waited so long. The result was closure where there had been open questions. The result was resolution where there had been absence. The result was an end to one of the longest fugitive searches in U.S. history. For victims' families and investigators, this brought closure. It was not the closure that brings a suspect to trial. It was not the closure that allows for new testimony or new evidence, but it was closure nonetheless. It was confirmation that the woman sought for 55 years had been located. It was certainty that she had lived under another name in a small Canadian town. It was the knowledge that the warrant had been resolved. It was the ability to close the file with finality. It was the ability to tell the families of James Kinne, Patricia Jones, and Francisco Guerrero that the search for Sharon Kinne had ended. It was the ability to honor the victims with the knowledge that the fugitive had been found. This moment also carried meaning beyond the Kinne case. It showed that anonymous tips can resolve cases decades later. It showed that cross-border cooperation can succeed even after half a century. It showed that warrants do not expire with time. It showed that a fugitive can be located through fingerprint comparison from routine records. It showed that justice, though delayed by 55 years, is not always denied. After 55 years, the fugitive was found dead in Taber, Alberta. For victims' families and investigators, this brought closure. And for every family still waiting, it is a reminder that truth can wait, but it does not always stay hidden forever. When the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and the Kansas City Police Department announced in late January 2025 that the warrant for Sharon Kinne had been resolved, the longest outstanding felony and murder warrant in U.S. history came to an end. The fugitive had been located. She had been confirmed deceased. No prosecution would follow. The file was closed. For the families of James Kinne, Patricia Jones, and Francisco Guerrero, this brought a form of closure. It was not the closure that brings a suspect into court. It was not the closure that allows new testimony or new evidence to be presented, but it was closure nonetheless. It was confirmation that the woman sought for 55 years had been found. It was certainty that she had lived under another name in a small Canadian town. It was the knowledge that the search had ended, not with an arrest, but with the quiet finality of death records and fingerprint matches. They could now speak of their loved ones without the constant uncertainty of where Sharon Kinne might be. They could remember them as they were, husbands, wives, individuals whose lives were taken, without the shadow of an unlocated fugitive hanging over every memory. They could honor them with the knowledge that the warrant had been resolved. For the community of Taber, Alberta, the announcement brought shock. Residents learned that the woman they had known as Diedra Glabus, Dee, who had run a local motel in the 1970s and later operated a Century 21 real estate agency, had been Sharon Kinne. They had greeted her in passing. They had done business with her. They had lived alongside her for decades. She had blended in completely. She had become part of the fabric of the town. The revelation left people stunned. Conversations turned to disbelief. They asked how it had been possible. They asked what they might have missed. The small prairie town of about 8,000 people, quiet streets, wide skies, a place where people know one another, found itself at the end of a 55-year manhunt. The shock was not anger, it was astonishment. It was the sudden realization that history had been living among them. It was the quiet reflection that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary secrets can be kept. Cross-border cooperation made this resolution possible. The anonymous tip in December 2023 went to U.S. authorities. Jackson County and Kansas City Police did not act alone. They reached out to Canadian law enforcement. They requested records from Alberta. They coordinated across jurisdictions. They moved carefully. They respected international protocols. They obtained funeral home records. They retrieved fingerprints taken at the time of death. They compared those prints to Sharon Kinne's known records from her 1960 arrest in Missouri. The match was conclusive on May 31, 2024. The announcement followed in January 2025. This was not a solo effort. It was partnership. It was trust between agencies in different countries. It was the quiet work of investigators who bridged borders to close a chapter. Fingerprint technology played a key role. The fingerprints from the funeral home were routine. They were standard procedure after death. They were not collected with suspicion. Yet they became the final piece. They confirmed the identity 64 years after her initial arrest. They showed that even the most ordinary records can hold extraordinary answers. They showed that technology, simple, reliable fingerprint comparison, can resolve cases when all else has failed. Anonymous tips remain one of the most powerful tools in long-term investigations. The tip in December 2023 was not from a witness. It was not from someone who had seen a crime. It was from someone who had known Diedra Glabus. It was from someone who had connected the name to the old warrant. It was from someone who chose to speak after years of silence. That single act ended a 55-year search. It showed that ordinary people can hold the key to extraordinary resolutions. It showed that tips do not need to be dramatic. They need only to be accurate. They need only to be timely. They need only to be shared. For the victims' families, this brought closure. They had waited decades for any word of Sharon Kinne. They had lived with the knowledge that she was out there, somewhere. They had carried the pain of unresolved cases. Now they knew. She had died in 2022. She had lived in Tabor, Alberta, under an alias. She had run a motel. She had sold real estate. She had blended in. The warrant was closed. The file was sealed. They could now speak of James Kinne, Patricia Jones, and Francisco Guerrero with the knowledge that the fugitive had been found. They could remember them as they were, husbands, wives, individuals whose lives were taken, without the constant question of where the person responsible might be. They could honor them with the certainty that the search had ended. This case leaves us with powerful lessons.
This resolution of the Sharon Kinne fugitive case carries lessons that reach far beyond Kansas City, beyond Mexico, and beyond the small prairie town of Tabor. It demonstrates the power of anonymous tips to resolve cases that have lingered for generations. In December 2023, someone chose to pick up the phone. They chose to contact the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and the Kansas City Police Department. They chose to share a name and a location they believed connected to an old warrant. That single act, anonymous, quiet, without fanfare, ended a 55-year search. It showed that tips do not need to come from witnesses or insiders. They do not need to be dramatic. They need only be accurate. They need only be shared. They need only come from someone who has carried a piece of information long enough to know it matters. One voice, one call, one moment of courage can close what time had left open. It also highlights the strength of cross-border investigations. When the tip arrived in the United States, authorities did not hesitate. They reached out to Canadian law enforcement. They requested records from Alberta. They coordinated across international lines. They respected protocols. They moved carefully. They waited for confirmation. They did not act alone. This was partnership. It was trust between agencies in different countries. It was the quiet work of investigators who bridged borders to bring finality. It showed that justice does not stop at national lines. It showed that cooperation can succeed even after half a century. It showed that when one country asks for help, another can answer. The longevity of warrants is another lesson here. The warrant for Sharon Kinne remained active in the Kansas City area from the late 1960s until 2025. It did not expire. It did not fade. It was carried forward through changes in technology, changes in personnel, changes in policy. It was reviewed. It was updated. It was kept alive. 55 years is a lifetime.
Officers who worked the case in the 1970s are long retired. Detectives who checked it in the 1990s have moved on, yet the warrant endured. It waited for the day when a tip would arrive. It waited for the day when fingerprints could be compared. It waited for the day when closure could be written. Warrants are promises. They are commitments to victims and their families. They are proof that time does not erase accountability. They are proof that a case can wait 55 years and still find resolution. The victims, James Kinne in 1960, Patricia Jones in 1962, Francisco Guerrero in 1964, had their lives taken by a suspected serial offender. James Kinne was shot in his bedroom in Independence, Missouri. Patricia Jones was killed in Kansas City. Francisco Guerrero was shot in a motel in Mexico. Their stories were separate in time, they were separate in place, they were separate in circumstance, yet they were connected by one person. Their families waited. They waited through trials, they waited through acquittals, they waited through escapes, they waited through silence. Now they know. The fugitive was found. She lived under another name. She died in 2022. The warrant is closed. The file is sealed. They can now speak of James, Patricia, and Francisco with the knowledge that the search has ended. They can remember them as they were, husbands, wives, individuals whose lives were taken, without the constant question of where the person responsible might be. They can honor them with the certainty that the truth has been acknowledged. If this story has stayed with you, if the endurance of those families, the power of an anonymous tip, the strength of cross-border cooperation, or the hope that long waits can still end has touched something in you, please consider taking one small step. If you have information about any unsolved case or fugitive, even something that feels small or distant, contact your local police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or Crime Stoppers. Your detail might be the one that fits. Your voice might be the one that brings peace to a family still waiting. If you value thoughtful, true crime narration, real fugitive stories, cold case breakthroughs, and justice narratives told with care for the victims and their families, please subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next case, the next update, the next moment when answers arrive. Like this video if it brought something meaningful to you. Share it respectfully to help spread awareness and honor James Kinne, Patricia Jones, and Francisco Guerrero. In the comments below, feel free to share your thoughts, always with kindness and consideration for the families who carry these stories. Which cold case would you like us to cover next? Your suggestions help guide what we bring to you. Sources for this episode include the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and Kansas City Police Department news release from January 30th, 2025, CBC News coverage of the Tabor confirmation, the Kansas City Star report on the warrant closure, Wikipedia's well-sourced entry, and additional reports from CBS News and Global News. Full links are in the description below. We will keep telling these stories, not to sensationalize, but to remember, to honor, to bear witness to both the loss and the long, steady road towards justice. Justice delayed, but never forgotten.